Can everyone hear me in the back? Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I am Casey Stark, Associate Teaching Professor in the Department of History, and I will be doing our introduction today. So welcome to the Department of History's public lecture in honor of Women's History Month, which is also being supported by the Department of Theater and Film. Our talk today is presented by Dr. Tracey Hanshew on Cowgirls, Rodeo, and Rural Feminism, 1890 to 1934. Dr. Hanshew is an assistant professor of history at Eastern Oregon University, where she teaches courses in women's history, diverse peoples of America, and on the American West. These topics are also the main themes of her scholarship, which focuses on the rural American West and explores feminism and ranching women and rodeo cowgirls at the turn of the 20th century. She is the recipient of the 2021 Western Heritage Wrangler Award for her article, "Here She Comes Wearing Them Britches: Saddles, Riding Skirts, and Social Reform in the Turn of the Century Rural West," published in Montana, the magazine of Western History. She has authored additional publications on cowgirls, including a monograph entitled "Oklahoma Rodeo Women" and an article, "Rodeo in Oklahoma is Women's Business: How Lucille Mulhall's Fame Created Opportunity in Rodeo," in the journal Chronicles of Oklahoma, for which she received the Muriel H. Wright Award from the Oklahoma Historical Society. She has ties to Oklahoma, if you can't tell. Other highlights of Dr. Hanshew's CV include a fellowship at the Hemmerich Center for American Research at the Bill Crease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where she presented at their symposium on gender and masculinities in the American West in fall 2018. Her service on the advisory board to Americana, the Journal of American Popular Culture 1900, and for the Rural Women's Studies Association as their membership and communication coordinator for the United States. In addition, she is active in public history, having been a guest speaker for the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada, at the Artifacts and Agraria Symposium in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and at regional museums across Oklahoma. So without further ado, I present Dr. Tracey Hanshew.
Thank you. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Thank you to Professor Stark for inviting me to present and for hosting. And thank you, Becky Brown, for organizing this event. And thank you to the BGSU History Department for such a warm welcome. For my background, just if you can't tell, I grew up in Texas. And I did grow up around rodeo. My dad rodeoed. He was a bull rider until my little sister came along. And we grew up on a ranch. We had cattle and horses that we used to what we call work the cattle, which basically means moving them from pasture to pasture or rounding them up to doctor them. So I'm naturally drawn to this subject and to this history of ranching and rodeo and the women who made that history. An opportunity to explore this topic came up when I was completing my master's degree at Syracuse University, where for my thesis, I had planned to examine how ranching women in the American West supported the national suffrage movement. This seemed logical to me because Wyoming was the first territory to extend the vote to women December the 10th of 1869. And then in 1890, they became the first state to do so. Of the 14 states where women gained the right to vote before ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, all but one was in the American West. Also, women in the rural West worked in tandem with men, meaning they did what at the time was viewed as men's work. Similarly, men helped women with women's work when needed. This was an arrangement that was common on small farms and ranches where all family members helped. And there's, excuse me, there's even an example of a woman whose husband kind of permanently got stuck making the biscuits because he was better at making the biscuits while she was out milking the cow. This type of work had an unexpected benefit for these women who enjoyed being outdoors and would much prefer an afternoon on horseback than doing the washing. But my initial hypotheses about that, that Western women could enjoy such freedoms, would support the national movement working to improve rights for all women, was wrong. So students, hear me when I say this. I was really dedicated to this in my master's thesis. So what do you do when you're wrong? Pivot, right? You pivot, so you don't have to redo everything. So I decided to look at why. Reworked the thesis to learn more about why ranching women did not support the national suffrage movement. And I came across this group of rodeo cowgirls who were extraordinary for their time. From there, I have been researching this topic ever since. It has a lot of intersectionality, which I'll talk about in a moment. And from there, it's moved from dissertation into a book, which will be called Branding Their Own, hopefully forthcoming very soon. So why are these incredible women left out of mainstream women's history, you might ask? And what did they do that was just so extraordinary? Also, this is a small group of women. Why would it matter? And I would say never underestimate a small group of women. So, like other groups that have been excluded from early histories, scholars initially wrote women's history into the narrative, doing so by identifying them in association with other history makers, often a wife like Abigail Adams to her husband, John Adams. Then women's history kind of made a shift and started looking at women who made first, women who were the first in their field, sometimes what we today call identifying, or we call breaking the glass ceiling. An example of this is often someone who's on a national stage, like Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, who, by the way, grew up on the Lazy Bee Ranch in Arizona. Finally, women have also started to be written into the narrative as they've been identified as rebels and radicals. These are the women who protest and who do so loudly. They're seen. They're very visible to the public. These are people in the first wave like Alice Paul, Susan B. Anthony, Mott and Stanton. In the second wave, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem. In sports, Billie Jean King with her famous match against Bobby Riggs. I could go on and on. But beyond feminist activism, where women work to make long-term change through federal legislation, and in connection often with very large organized movements that have their origins in urban areas, I have found that there are women who promote change through their actions rather than words. And they most often advocate for change at a local and regional level. In other words, they look to change things that are very central in their lives. Where many feminists openly state their purpose when they march, protest, and lobby, and as I said, are highly visible and come into contact with what might be very plentiful recruits, right, to encourage and enlarge their movement, women in rural areas do not. In their own words, they describe their actions as living rather than talking. So they walk the walk, so to speak. Failing to recognize the contribution of these women, however, because they don't fit the characteristics of what we sometimes call traditional feminist, self-identifying as a feminist, using those very public methods of protest, and not intending to make national change, which rural women do not. This leaves us a really incomplete record of women's history. And in fact, we're leaving out a huge portion of the women's population. Until 1920, the majority of Americans lived in rural areas. So a couple of parameters today, just to clarify some things. When I say cowgirls here, today I mean women who work on a ranch. That's a cowgirl in my mind. So these are women who have been working with cattle, are in professional rodeo. Rodeo cowgirls in this study did compete in rodeos that were the precursor to today's professionalized sport. The Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association, which is most widely known as the PRCA, or the later we have the Women's Rodeo Association, the WRCA. If you did not know, women are the first professional athletes in the United States in women's sports. And between the 1890s and 1935, rodeo cowgirls looked very different than today. They rode in all the rough stock. So they rode broncs, they roped, they steer wrestled, they rode steers and sometimes bulls, all events that are no longer available to them in that capacity in today's professional rodeo. Okay, so as I said, a problem with the methodology that limits women's history to major events or first overlooks the majority of the female population, which, as I said, largely lived in rural areas until 1920. Also, if we exclude these rural women in the West, we cannot fully understand how or why. They were the first ones to gain such liberties as voting, property ownership, and non-traditional employment, all actions that seem feminist in nature, nor could they accomplish, or nor can we understand how they accomplished goals ahead of other women. So my goal in my research was to expand the study of rural women whose life in this unique environment provided opportunities for them to live outside the normal parameters of socially defined gender roles and to present a more comprehensive understanding in the history of women. Ranching and rodeo cowgirls in the late 19th and 20th century were deeply rooted in their rural lifestyle, working these new jobs, masculine jobs, and blending work that required a physical fitness and practical clothing that was not largely acceptable in mainstream society. Yet the wish to remain feminine meant that they created a new image, which we today call the cowgirl. Just briefly, some of the feminist theory, for those of you who don't have a strong background in that, or maybe want to hear it again. The definition of feminism has been contentious since its inception. And if we agree that feminism in the United States appeared largely in the antebellum North, among middle-class women, then cowgirls and feminists are not going to go together. In fact, it would be much more like oil and water. But women activists in the West used methods of their own that were suited for their environment and their personal needs. So were parades and speeches that mirrored the methods of the national organizations and were successful in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco. Newspapers and community clubs were better suited to convey these messages to women in rural areas. Abigail Scott Duniway is probably the most prominent activist from the West, and she is a person who experienced both worlds. She moved west on the Oregon Trail, and she endured the hardships of relocating there and starting a new life in the territory with her husband, where they built a farm. He died unexpectedly of an accident, and she moved to Portland. There, she turned her attention toward women's issues and dedicated her work to suffrage. She employed those traditional protest methods in cities along the northern Pacific coast, giving speeches, organizing rallies and marches, and she called for equal economic property rights for women. She called for divorce reforms and a shared responsibility for housework and children, and better education for women. So she did have some overlap with the national agenda. But she also remembered her rural roots and her farm life. And she recognized that those women did not have need for all of this, all of these same goals. And so to reach the women and a broader audience in rural areas, in 1872, she started a women's rights newspaper named the New Northwest. Newspapers then became an important method of reaching the public in rural areas, and several newspapers were created by women in multiple territories and states west of the Mississippi River. The characteristic of Western activists reflected their ability to overcome hardships as described by women like Dunway, who rose to the occasion to make reform successful without larger organizations stepping in and taking over, which representatives of the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association did at times when they came west to attempt to recruit for their cause. Dunway often used the idea of the mythic West to promote suffrage. She argued that women were frontier heroines, and those are her words, because they traveled west experiencing additional sacrifices to those of men. In one speech at the Nassau Convention in 1900, she said, "The true dreams of men of the West are not truly recognized or realized until the most important discovery of the century had been made, when the women of the Great West discovered herself." Dunway also pointed out the divergence between Western women and Easterners, saying, quote, "The people in Oregon do not like professional agitators, but they love liberty." So to Dunway, professional agitators and well-funded suffragists from the East had no place in their mythical frontier, and she and many others resented their interference in the West. There were some, very few national suffrage members who did seem more in tune to Western values. Anna Howard Shaw, who was a Methodist minister, suffragist, and four-time president of Nassau, spoke at Pendleton, Oregon during the annual rodeo, which is called the Roundup. She said, this is how she described her experience. "There at Pendleton, I spoke during the great Roundup, holding the meeting at night on the street, in which thousands of horsemen, cowboys, Indians, and ranchmen were riding up and down, blowing horns and shouting and singing. It seemed impossible to interest an audience under such conditions, but never have we had more courteous or enthusiastic listeners. Best of all, they not only cheered our sentiments, but they followed up with their votes. And when I finished, one of the cowboys rode close to me and asked for my New York address. 'You'll hear from me later,' he said." Not long after, she received a banner in the New York headquarters of the suffrage movement that had a pen and ink sketch of the cowboy and his horse superimposed over the words, "Woman suffrage, we are all for it." And I tell you that story because it's an important note about cowboys supporting suffrage and supporting women in their efforts to improve their lives in these rural areas, and we'll come back to that. So expanding the study of women to include those who made general efforts to improve their lives within the context of their own environment. In this case, one that I believe characterizes rural feminism. We can also open the door for research in many other topics and themes to learn more about this pastoral life and the development of gender roles that are unique to rural areas. More importantly, these cowgirls will reach a boundary of influence that doesn't stop in the arena in the West. They will meet people on a national level, internationally, and rodeo, as it expands globally, will give them the opportunity to show the rest of the world what they can do. Very briefly, the Western normative starts with those women like Dunaway who move out on the Oregon Trail. And many of them will attempt to restructure their life as they knew it in the East, in their farms and homes on the West. We have diaries of several who want the girls to stay prim and proper and to dress in their Sunday clothes when they go to town and stay very feminine. The reality of this will be that it takes everyone to make the farms and ranches work so that everyone in the family can eat. And that is why we have that more equitable work division that's not necessarily defined by gender roles that the rest of the country practiced at the time. As I said before, husbands cooked biscuits, women milked the cows, girls would ride very early and learn how to do all kinds of farm and ranch work. So the normative doesn't stay the same for long. They incorporate a bit of what's already in existence in the West. Watching some of the vaqueras, this is very much dependent on class. And it's a whole nother lecture to talk about the Spanish hierarchy in working on large ranchos and latifundillas. So I'll just say briefly that if it's someone who's lower class, you might see an actual vaquera working. If they're upper class, no. Also, there are some examples of African-American freed women who had their own ranches in South Texas, many of whom were known very well for their horse training skills. And so women who were Anglo and moved into those areas were able to see these examples of these women who were making it on their own. And again, they kind of come up with this hybrid of what I call the Victorian West, where they're still dressing very feminine when they're in public. But when these girls are having to do their chores on the ranches at home, a lot of them are wearing their brother's clothes. It's not practical to wear some of the fabrics and dresses when you're feeding the chickens or milking the cow. Also, rodeo is going to start with roundups, ranch roundups on large unfenced open range. Requires a certain number of cow hands, and I say cow hands because they are multicultural and both genders were working in this capacity, so both male and female working in this capacity. So it was necessary to round up cattle, to bring them in from their winter hills, to come back into the green pastures for the summer, also to count the cattle, to doctor cattle, vaccinate them, and so on. And so they started with early roundups. And, you know, at the end of the day, when they've been working all day long in the heat and the dust, and one cowboy says to another, man, you can't catch that calf for anything. What do? It's a contest. Who's going to rope that calf the fastest? That's how this gets started. Eventually, people from one ranch or another, neighboring ranches, especially in Oklahoma Panhandle and the Texas Panhandle, will compete against each other. And from there, rodeo will start, because people will start to say, why don't you compete during the 4th of July? Why don't you compete on Mother's Day or whatever? And so they would start to say, okay, these two ranches are going to have this competition. Let's make some ice cream. Let's have a parade. And that's how it gets started. Okay. As I said before, a A lot of the rodeo cowgirls that I research grew up on ranches. This, it's hard to see from here. This is a little girl who's out working with her father, checking on cattle. And a lot of them got their start in that way. They worked along with the ranch hands in some cases, learned the skills that the vaqueros taught to the Anglo cowboys, and eventually started in those competitions as well. One example of a woman who moved from West Virginia and left her home there to move with her husband to Montana is a woman named Nanny Alderson. We do not have a lot of autobiographies or primary sources for many of these ranch women. I don't know if you've ever worked on a ranch, but it doesn't leave a lot of time for writing. Alderson is one who left us her autobiography. She mentioned when they moved to Montana in 1883 that she wanted to retain those familiar customs. She wanted to keep her nice dresses and her clothing, only to find out that it was very impractical to wear those delicate fabrics when she was working both inside and out, and they ended up getting torn. Also, the only thing she had to clean with in Montana was a tub of hard lye soap. And she was new. She didn't know how to accurately mix the lye. So she ruined a lot of her clothes when she first got there. She did ride a saddle horse, and she rode side saddle most of the time, again, trying to stay proper. She never rode what we call cross saddle or astride the way that we do today. So the men did most of the work with the cattle, but she did ride out across their land. She eventually, like many of these women, will start her own business. She will use the unconventional opportunities available to her, and she started getting into the stock business herself. She was given an orphaned colt and then later a motherless calf to nurse back to health. So while she was doing that, she decided she would just write to Helena, to the capital, and have them record a brand for her. And that's how she started. And many of the women who started that way became very successful in ranching. And this is a time when, again, socially, men at the market are going to reject their presence. A lot of them will reject their product as well. Women were not supposed to know about or discuss animal husbandry at all, was completely improper. And so the fact that they overcame this to have very successful ranches worked well to their advantage. As I said, everyone had to work in the families, including young daughters. Children learned to ride at a very early age before they could sit alone on a horse. Many of them had their mothers tie them to the saddle and sit there astride until they could learn and reach the reins and learn to do it themselves. We have many reports of young girls learning to ride and riding before they could walk. As I said, many of them outside of the public eye wore their brother's clothes and did what men typically did. And they were safe in wearing those men's clothes there. There were a lot of cities that had either laws against women wearing pants and some against women wearing riding astride, or city ordinances that were also put into place. A couple of women went to jail trying to get this changed because they lived 12 miles out of town, and they decided it really wasn't practical to change the saddle just to ride into town. And so this is another way, especially those of you that read the article about side saddles know, another way that they advocated for a change. When traveling to town, many of them had a dress that they would use to go to town, just so they didn't have to mess with the fine or being run out of town. in some cases, this happened to Evelyn Cameron in Miles City, Montana. The cowgirl then will become known as she becomes public. And the first place this really happens when she's working in the capacity as a cowgirl. Some of the women worked off the ranches, and so the neighboring ranch would go over and say, you know, I need an extra hand. I've got 6 new horses and everybody's busy. And often a father who would say, you can take my 2 best hands if you pay for them. And most of the time that was the girls. The girls were very talented at training horses. And so that's one way that they got exposure into the public eye. Also Wild West shows, and Wild West shows spread along with rodeo to kind of tell the story of the West. So you know that Wild West shows are primarily entertainment, I hope, but this really bridges between roundups and rodeo to allow or open the door, if you will, for cowgirls to come into the public arena. So the Wild West shows opened with a story, a scripted story of the conquest of the West. And this is an important part of the history because it's where it starts the preservation of that idea of conquest in the West. And it moves, I would argue, from Wild West shows into rodeo, where we still have to some degree a living history of what happened. And for a long time, rodeo told that narrative too. The last 10 years, they're starting to kind of change the story when you go to a rodeo. Many people will identify probably someone you recognize on the screen, Annie Oakley as America's first cowgirl in the 1880s. The first use of the cowgirl, the word cowgirl, had appeared in newspapers earlier than Oakley was on stage, about 30 years earlier. And she is someone who definitely draws attention to women who were what I would call actual working cowgirls. Oakley is a shootist, and she was, of course, the most well-known one in the world. And she performed with Buffalo Bill's Wild West for quite some time. He's the one who kind of helped to make her famous because he had so many shows. I think her fame really came on her own merit because of her competency with the gun. She did work with a couple of other shows at a certain point, and kind of gives us a bridge of someone who retains that proper Victorian attire. She's always dressed very modestly. She takes tea fairly often while they're on the road. And so it was important to her to present that kind of persona. At some point, the West shows will kind of change and start to include more women like Lula Bell Parr, who started to do exhibition rides. So these are not competition bronc rides at the Wild West shows, it's just for show. So she would be contracted X number of dollars to go ride this bronc. The woman who really changed this rodeo is Lucille Mulhall. And she will become nationally known as the first cowgirl who was a working cowgirl. She grew up on a ranch in central Oklahoma. She learned to rope and ride at the age of 4. And she was so good at roping in her early teens, she started competing and roping against adult men. And eventually she had the opportunity to entertain for then candidate for Vice President Teddy Roosevelt, who was in Oklahoma. And the result of that was that she and her family would get to entertain him and the Rough Riders at their reunion in 1900. I mentioned newspapers and headlines, and they highlight these cowgirls with some really clever headlines. She was referred to a lot as Miss Lucille Mulhall, the cowpuncher queen of Oklahoma Territory, or Miss Mulhall at the reunion, New York world story of Oklahoma's brave cowgirl. It goes on and on. There's even one that talks about her as a lassoer in lingerie. And so this leads her into both Wild West shows and in competition. And eventually the Mulhalls will get to perform at the inaugural parade for McKinley and Roosevelt. And this will bring more attention to women who can do things outside of what was scripted in the Wild West shows. These were, as I said, important in expanding the popularity of the history of the West, in the history of the era, where early women are scripted into these programs as kind of a damsel in distress that needs to be rescued from some cowboy or military unit. The women will eventually start to integrate themselves into more and more acts. Annie Oakley's not the only sharpshooter. Lillian Smith and May Lilly also are very accurate sharpshooters that are part of the shows. And as they become more popular with the audiences and they become more comfortable with the shows, the more they do, the more comfortable the audience, the more women start doing, like Louisville Parr's efforts to right a wrong. Bill Cody, just briefly, Bill Cody is probably a bit ahead of his time in his hiring practices because he is one who openly stated he believed in equality. In 1898, he said, every year, every month, every day, new fields are opening up to women, and it does me good. They deserve what they get. If a woman does the same work as a man does, just as well, she should have the same pay. Now, he said he paid his women the same, but his payroll records show that he really kind of didn't do that. He has some very interesting hierarchies for how he pays. And of the women, Oakley is the highest paid because she's the most popular member of the cast. All right, so how did Cowgirls actually, resist? What was their activism? There are a couple of areas that are worth looking at. Work, athletes, fashion, the freedom to travel, managing their career, and continuing their careers after marriage and children. So the first evidence we have in the record is Prairie Rose Henderson, and she entered a saddle bronc riding in the Frontier Days Rodeo, which is in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in 1901. And the committee said, you can't compete because you're a woman. And she said, show me the rules that exclude female riders. Well, they didn't have them, so they had to let her ride. And this really kind of starts women increasing their participation athletically and starting actual careers to advance themselves both socially and economically. Some rodeo companies would host an event with 2 strings of bucking stock. That just means a group of horses, bucking stock. All of them are pretty rank, maybe not quite as much as the one you see here, but women would ride what they called showy buckers. Those were broncs that would kick very high, but didn't necessarily have the twists and turns and the really hard bucks that a man's horse would. And so the stock contractors kind of justified this, saying the Cowgirls needed an easier ride, and they scored higher points on those showy buckers, but they always advocated to just have the same horses that the men did. And when they did ride those same horses that the men did, they scored very well. And in fact, we do have an example when they were still competing against each other. of Bertha Kaepernick coming within just a few points of the men's champion in Pendleton, Oregon. And at that point, she was so close to beating this guy out of the championship that they changed the rules. Immediately after that, we have two divisions. We have ladies bronc riding and men's bronc riding. And so the girls were very good at riding these horses. I mentioned that they overcame a lot of negative views about women being athletic anyway. At the time, there's a huge concern that women were too delicate to participate in anything athletic. Competition was considered unladylike. Even doctors weighed in on this in various newspapers. In the case of riding a bicycle, the medical community said that it was too much physical activity for women and that they would risk by riding a bicycle, quote, uterine displacement, spinal shock, pelvic damage, and hardened abdominal muscles. So with this perception and in the context of rodeo, women would certainly face irrevocable physical damage. But these cowgirls again overcame it. They found the ability to control their own bodies. And by doing so, many of these women would ride through their injuries. Some of them very severe. There were cases of women who were knocked out cold and carried out of the arena. And when they came to, they went back in the arena and rode that bronc again. And so Tad Lucas rode trick riding one-handed for 2 years because she crushed one of her arms. So these women kept going. By the way, there's no evidence that women sustained more injuries than men. Okay, let's see. I mentioned the Pendleton Roundup and Bertha Kaepernick, who was the first woman to compete for the Bucking Horse Championship under the men's rules. She too later owned her own bucking stock and started her own business. She had some of the most famous bucking horses in rodeo at the time. And one named Cyclone was one of the men's horses. 129 men could not ride that horse until 1912 when Tom Three Persons rode in Calgary, Alberta. So women became such talented athletes that some rodeo companies wanted to insure them. And so once a cowgirl signed a contract, so they would go in and ride competitively, but they also were contracted in some cases to trick ride or to do exhibition rides. They also would run relays. And so sometimes they would have a contract to do that to hold their place. In one example, there's a contract with Fox Hastings, who you see here. And she got a Western Union telegram, that's way before we had texting. In September of 1915, the rodeo committee said, "We're very concerned that you're planning to rodeo before you're scheduled to ride here in Pendleton." And they warned her, "Do not ride. You are at risk of injury." And so they wanted to make sure, because she's a big name, she draws in tickets, and they wanted to make sure that she rode in Pendleton. Women also were able to ride through a grueling schedule. Some of them, like Holden, she rides 27 broncs in one day in Tampa, Florida at a rodeo. So they really pushed back against the fact that women should not be athletic. And the concern was that socially, people thought that they would not stay feminine, that would make them masculine, and that would be unnatural. And so they would go to the extreme in the fashion that they wore to ensure the audience was comfortable and knowing that they weren't becoming too manly, and they often decorated their costumes with more trimmings and bows. You can see here the Greenhouse sisters putting their lipstick on before they go in. They had these great big hats. And here you can see Ruth Roach with one of those bows that's a shoulder to shoulder bow. She also rode in her pearls. Most of the girls' blouses were silk, so they were very feminine, and they did that intentionally to reassure the audience that they were still feminine, that they were still mothers, that they were still wives. And in this way, they were able to make changes to fashion so that the audience would be more accepting. And I'll go through these fairly quickly, and we can come back during Q&A if we need to, but they go from the split skirts to more like a bloomer, which the bicyclists were wearing, eventually to jodhpurs, which after World War I, these are kind of patterned after the doughboys. Here you can see, this is a relay team, so their jodhpurs are a little bit loud. And in 1922, pants, and Vera McGinnis is the one who first created the pants. They weren't going to be allowed to ride in the rodeo in Fort Worth if they had their pants or trousers, as they called them. And the Fort Worth Fat Stock Show said the women are not going to wear those in this arena. And the cowboys said, if the women don't wear them, then we're not riding and you won't have a rodeo. So the men really supported them. And this was important in their career. Sorry, I meant to take that out. This was important in their career, and I'm out of time, so I'm going to go quickly. Women also worked in the off season during the off season of rodeo, just so they could get back into that career. This was to support their rodeo career. Some of them did stunts in Hollywood, others rode in other countries, and so whatever they needed to do. They also, many of them married into rodeo family. Jean Krieg married her husband at one rodeo, and they went up the road to another one. That was their honeymoon. So they were both very dedicated. And as you can see, many families also. One of the cowgirls loses her marriage, and a lot of them were married multiple times, but Vera McGinnis loved rodeo so much. Her career was taking off and her husband's career was declining. And he decided to stay home. And she said, I've already signed up for rodeos. And he said, go. And she went, came back to find her marriage was ended. But she said it never even occurred to her to end the marriage. Her choice was the rodeo. And as you can see, families rodeoed with their parents, some of them single parents. And this is Mitzi Lucas Riley and her mother, who is the one I told you rode trick riding with one hand. Mitzi Lucas, and I'll end with this, Mitzi Lucas said, the difference between the women's liberation movement to the cowgirls and her mother's generation, that the cowgirls did not even recognize that they had restrictions. They were doing this intentionally. Their advocacy was for what they needed to make their career successful. The fact that up to 25,000 people in Chicago saw them rodeoing and that caused a ripple effect was not necessarily something they intended to do. And Mitzi said, you know, her mother and her mother's generation were definitely their own women. She said some of them were married and they just lived their own life. I always said my mother was the most independent, probably the first feminist that I can ever remember. She said it wasn't even popular then, and we didn't even know that she was. So these rodeo cowgirls may not have self-identified as feminist, but nevertheless, they did accomplish great gains every time they stepped into a rodeo arena. It improved women's worth and competence. Quickly, what pushes them out of rodeo is more cowboys coming in who didn't grow up on ranches, who saw easy money during the Great Depression. And so that's what kind of pushed women out of rodeo in 1935. And one of the things that rodeo changed, I guess it's on this too, is that they changed the requirement. As I said, women were doing very well. They were making great money during the Depression. On average, I think it was 28% higher income than the rest of the country during the Depression. We know that in 1935, the average salary for the Cowboys was $2,000 a year. The women, including Tad Lucas, was making $12,000 a year. And so as people were, really struggling during the Depression, and the rodeo came to town and held the rodeo in Madison Square Garden, people who'd been in that soup line saw that if they could pay an entry, get on a horse, stay on for 12 seconds, they could win a jackpot, win some money. And they did not have that background of working in tandem with the women. And they saw the women as competition instead. So they slowly start feeding the media, really, and the newspapers language that say that, women shouldn't be doing that. It's too rough for women and too many injuries. In 1929, Bonnie McCarroll, who was a very popular cowgirl, died on a bronc because the rodeo had changed the requirements for women, making them ride what they call hobbled stirrups. This is a stirrup on a regular saddle. The bronc saddles are a little bit different. And then this piece of leather here is what today we would call the hobble strap. It holds this other piece of leather up. But at that time on a bronc saddle, there's a piece of leather that goes underneath the belly of the horse. And the idea was that it would hold their feet in the stirrups better. But what ended up happening is that they ended up getting caught and they couldn't dismount. And hobbled stirrups killed more women in rodeo than any other injury. And so that was how they started the narrative to try to push women out. By 1941, the last woman who rode a bronc rode in Madison Square Garden in New York. And women had to start their own professional organization after that. Sorry. Okay, so I really think that this is an important group that's been overlooked. Historically, I think most women in rural settings have done a lot more to contribute to women's history than what we've looked at in the past. It just so happens that this was one little topic that I came across and was incredibly interested in. And as I said, it's opened the doors for many, many other lines of study and topics that make this a really rich area to investigate. Thank you so much for coming.